If you truly want to accomplish your passion project, you really need to sit down and write out everything you're going to do. A lot of these animation projects that I thought were done by single animators are actually done by like teams of friends. I didn't realize that what I was doing was kind of weird.
What's it like working as an individual on a project like this?
I tried to make this project 4 or 5 times. It just all came crashing into itself because I didn't know how to organize a production. I'm an individual creator, I'm not a studio. If I'm gonna make a production with a non-traditional team, then I need a non-traditional production. 60% actually occurred over my parental leave.
You thought, let's go.
I'm gonna finish this. When the 4000 came out, the asset browser and the geometry nodes, those tools really enable individual artists to produce a lot more content. You're the first person that's asked me about this.
I'm not knocking it at all.
No, I'm excited that somebody saw that and thought that.
Shotty, I've just worked out how to use a soundboard. I'm just going to do a very cheesy intro.
Okay.
Shotty, welcome to the VFX process. Can I get one of these? Yeah, that's pretty good.
It worked, yeah.
It's a live audience we've got here.
Yeah.
Can you just start off by introducing yourself and tell us what you do?
So I run SouthernShotty, which started as an Instagram account with my own artwork and has progressed into a channel where I help teach Blender to the community. In terms of the work that I do professionally, I've worked in small ad agencies and studios for a long time, moving into more tech work and then building up my own channel. That kind of enabled me to produce some of my own artwork and my short film as well, and that's kind of what I've been working on recently.
A lot of people may think that you're solely 3D or your main skill set is 3D, but in fact it's actually After Effects and 2D is a very big part of your skill set.
Yeah, so it's funny, a lot of people know me as the Blender guy. When I talk to people, they're like, oh yeah, Shotty, he does like the Blender stuff, right? And I'm like, yeah, but I actually have way more professional experience in After Effects and 2D, and I actually used the Adobe Suite quite a bit on Watermelon Girl. So I had always wanted to be an animator since I was very young. I didn't think that I could necessarily get a career in it because in the 90s, pretty much the only animation careers, somewhere like Disney or DreamWorks. So I was actually going into film and other things. And while I was in college, After Effects started really changing how it worked. There started to be a shift in which you were seeing more traditional style animation done in After Effects. And then it just like clicked with me that like, oh, I could make money animating. So the majority of my early career was social media style text, explainer videos, and then always replacing phone screens. There was always these live action shoots and they're like, we need somebody to track and replace this phone screen. And I, at some point, like, I don't want to do this. That's when I started my Instagram and really started producing more character work because I was like, I want to get more into character animation and creating worlds and designs.
And was that always something that you did in your time, like drawing characters and things?
I don't entirely know like why I had such a drive for it. I do know that growing up, I loved catching critters, frogs, turtles, and I was obsessed with animals. Just my whole life. And I think I just wanted to kind of draw and make my own growing up on Pokemon and the early 90s being kind of like the end of that peak era of Saturday morning cartoons tied to toy lines. I think I really like the idea of characters and bringing them into the real world. And by adding animation, you're kind of taking your characters, adding life and making them feel a bit more real and authentic. There's that saying where it's like kids now grew up with the internet, but we grew up with the internet, meaning as in, the internet started at the beginning of my life and I've watched it change over time. And it's interesting how it's kind of like radically altered creative opportunities. And I'm kind of glad because I spent the first half of my life in traditional art classes and other things, learning how to do everything by hand. Now, when I went to school, now I had access to film equipment. I'm kind of grateful for that because I was able to discover animation on my own. But because I took those live action classes, I had a deep understanding of how a camera worked and how lighting worked and like film theory. And I think that ended up playing a much greater role than, just a few animation classes could have. Watermelon Girl, my focus was more on the color theory and the lighting and the composition because that's like, where my skill set lied.
The main project that we would like to just chat about today and kind of dive into is Watermelon Girl. Can you just tell us how that began?
Watermelon Girl is one of those characters I created. I created her in high school. As my animation skill set grew, I kind of like returned to the idea, and I was like, I'd really like, to do this idea. So I actually tried it in college. I tried Blender, and that was before Blender 2.8. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, 2.8 was the update where they like did the big user interface refresh. Prior to that, it was insanely unintuitive. And so I had a real hard time like learning, and I was trying and I failed. And I tried to make this project like 4 or 5 times. I tried it in 3D. I was like, I can't do 3D. I tried it in 2D, and I was like, I'm not good enough. I tried to make it in a game in Game Maker, and I was like, boy, that was harder than I thought. And then I tried it again in 2D when I had more After Effects knowledge, and I was like, all right, like After Effects is getting better. Maybe I can use that. I was like, boy, that took like forever. I can't do that. So then I started doing like a weird mixture of like I was doing 3D references, and I wasn't good enough to texture, light, or rig yet. So then I would bring that over to 2D software and then draw over it. But it took so long. I was like, I can't do this. And I tried 3D again, and then I was like, oh boy, like it just all came crashing into itself because I didn't know how to organize a production. And then this last iteration finally stuck. And the first assets I made for this version were about 5 years ago. And a lot of the beginning of that journey was kind of like building assets, learning how production in 3D works, and kind of learning as I went. And then the actual production was about 2 years. I'd say that between 40 to 60% of the production actually occurred over my parental leave. And I was like, yeah, we had a baby and I had 10 weeks off. And
you thought, let's go.
I did. Yes. I bought a plastic folding table from Walmart, and I popped it up next to the baby's crib, and I set up my laptop and then hooked up the Ethernet so that I could send renders to my desktop. And I just left the computer on for like those entire 10 weeks. I kind of got like into a mindset where like, oh, like I'm going to finish this. And I kind of hit this threshold that once I had made a certain amount of the film, I'm really big on reusing assets and systems. So it'd be like, oh, I made the grass system. I can use the grass system on every scene now. Oh, I already did her walking. Let me like import that action and put it here. And then I'll just do an animation layer and make her turn on that walk. So, I started reusing stuff. So, the further I got into it, the faster it started going.
You started it a few years before. You're building assets. You got your shot list or your shotty list.
Yeah.
As things change, how did you change along with it? Like starting out in 2.79, carrying on with the project and making sure that everything still works as the software develops?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So those initial runs and versions, they were failures, but they were learning steps. Now, with what you're asking, and I believe what you're asking is more on the technical side of things because the software was changing a lot. 3 major things occurred. 1, RTX got developed with the 4090 coming out, and NVIDIA contacted me and partnered my channel to promote the 4090. So I got a 4090 early on. That radically altered everything. Prior, I had been using a 2000 series, and prior to that, I'd been using a 10,000 series. When I was on that 10,000 series, it was very hard to produce artwork, and I was having to like send things to a render farm to get results. But when the 4000 came out, suddenly it was like, it cost me more time to send things to the render farm than it did just to like do it on my own. Like I just flick over to Cycle's render live view and I could just see what things were going to look like. AI denoising came out too, and that radically altered things. So that development really enabled me as an individual creator to produce content. I've been in lifetime NVIDIA user, so despite the fact they're a partner of my channel is like, I would say all that anyways. But anyways, Blender, I started in the late 2 series, and I didn't stop updating until 3.5 because I was using Rigify. They changed the way the rigging layer menu worked because it was pretty rough. They made it very nice now. But unfortunately, what that meant is that like importing my rigs to the new version of Blender was going to be a nightmare. So I stopped at 3.5. But things that they added along in that production pipeline, being the asset browser and geometry nodes, was like perfect because here's the thing. I'm an individual creator. I'm not a studio. If I'm going to make a production with a non-traditional team, then I need a non-traditional production. I see a lot of people trying to produce films and they immediately set it up like a traditional production. And it's like, you don't have 100 people and producers. There's a lot of successful and great projects that come out of those. But what I see is that it's like they sacrifice one thing. And what I wanted with mine, I wanted to make something that looked like a final film that had all the parts in it. My buzzword was scalability. So I did all the visuals myself. There's, occasionally an asset pack and textures here or there, but, I rendered, put together all scenes, animated everything, edited everything, composited everything myself. I only hired out audio. So I had to think about what's scalable? What can one person do to tell the story? So you'll notice that none of my characters have fingers or toes. Most of them don't even have arms. Some of them are only animating eyes. So I designed my characters in a way that they would require way less animation. And I put all of my effort into character design and character appeal, trying to get strong silhouettes, cute emotes through what little bit they had, and trying to bring a unique flavor to it with style so that it looked like these characters were simple by intention and not out of necessity. And then trying to find systems I could reuse. For example, the yarn grass I have is the same system used in every single scene, and trying to build environmental systems. So that forest is all made in geometry nodes, but then I can import that system into other scenes and build a swamp much easier. That's why when they made the asset browser and the geometry nodes, it was a radical alteration to my workflow that enabled me to do this, because I could create my own systems and geometry nodes and then reuse them in every scene. For example, the sky, the clouds, and the sun, it's like a plane with a paper texture that's animated on it, but I can change the color to match whatever time of day I want, and I could flick the clouds between clouds or stars, and then I could have control over the density and the amount and the placement and the distance between them. And then I had a sun and a moon object that I could flick on and off in between. And then I was using ray casting, so there was no intersection with those. And then I have this system, and suddenly I have my sky made for every single scene. And then with it being free software and having such a large community, there was a lot you can find on the internet. So I bought and downloaded a ton of geometry node systems and setups that really kind of enabled me to work quicker. So I don't think if those things had come out during mid-production, I think I probably would have failed again. But I believe those tools in particular really enable individual artists to produce a lot more content.
You're trying to build it as efficiently as possible. It's essential as a small production. Stylistically, was there a reason for the water changed style when you was up at a high 3/4 when the water was hitting the beach? Was it just this is going to be problematic to do this style at this angle?
You're the first person that's asked me about this, so I'm impressed by that you thought.
I'm not knocking it at all. I was just curious to the decision,
No, I'm excited that somebody saw that and thought that, because the number one compliment I've actually gotten on the film has been the water, which is funny because it was born out of the necessity of I can't do water sims, So basically what happened is I had started with the cardboard waves. I liked the visuals. It did well on social media, and I felt like it fit the film stylistically. But then the problem, as you called out, is it became very limiting in angles. I was like, oh, this cardboard water only works from a flat front angle. I can't turn the camera, I can't angle the camera, and I don't want every single shot to just be a flat front shot. I was like, it's just gonna look cheap. There's not gonna be interesting angles. I'm gonna lose a lot of flexibility. And so I was trying it from different angles and trying to figure out, can I fill the bottom? Can there be something under the waves? Can I cheat it and angle the waves back? And it just was not working. So the different styles of water were born out of necessity for what I believed, which more camera angles were more important than maintaining the same water style. I'm not going to try and cheat this cardboard into some weird other systems. It's going to be a completely new type of water system from this angle. But the cohesive factor is the paper and its cardboard. There's 3 types of water. There's the cardboard waves. There's when it's up above, on the islands, and you have the paper rolls. And then there's in the opening and the beach scene where there's just flat paper. Yeah, when it moves in between the scenes, it radically alters style. But you'll notice that the other thing I did is the cardboard only appears in shots close to the water. and the paper only appears when the camera's far away from the water. And that was intentional. There was a lot of thought that went into creating that contrast, but trying to maintain cohesion. So it's interesting you asked that, because I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make that all work.
Got a note here about the style. Was there any inspiration, or did you look at anything from like Little Big Planet?
I love Little Big Planet. Yeah, there's a lot there. I think that was a style I'd been developing over time, even before working on Watermelon Girl. And as I said, like growing up in the 90s, I really saw where we quit doing analog art and started doing digital art only. When I was young, one of my favorite like core memories is that every Halloween, my mom, my dad, and I would build out these like monster decorations, and we did one every year. So I grew up doing like a lot of crafts, and that created a love for movies that had handmade stuff. So I really liked like Jim Henson puppets. I really liked anything with Stan Winston, Phil Tidbit. I really latched onto like 80s stuff and early 90s stuff a lot more, because I liked seeing like, oh, they made stuff. Like, look how crazy, Alien or Predator looks. I loved all that stuff. But digital art is so much easier. And I wanted to try and create something that felt tactile and handmade in 3D. Everything looks like a toy. I'm not trying to trick anybody into thinking that it's actual stop motion. Rather, it's a 3D film inspired by stop motion. Now, when I look at the sources that inspire me, The Dark Crystal, that's one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, I was going to say, I bet you like Dark Crystal.
Yeah, all the stop motion movies, of course. But honestly, I'd say that most of my inspiration were like from video games. I'm a huge gamer, so like one of the ones was they did the remake of Link's Awakening, and I love the toy-like look they had there. Little Big Planet, in particular Sackboy, and then I really liked Tearaway and It Takes Two, all these things.
That's an incredible game.
It Takes Two was actually the idea for Watermelon Girl's hair.
Okay.
I had been trying to do clay hair, and I was trying to do the fuzzy hair from Wallace and Gromit, and I was like, this isn't working. I can't figure this out technically. And then I was playing It Takes Two. She walked out with the yarn hair. I'm like, that's it. That's it. Because I had also tried yarn hair, and I couldn't get it to work because I was doing textures and like simulations and hair particles, and I looked at it, I was like, they literally just like wrapped the model in a couple simple tubes and gave it a yarn texture, and like boom, I discovered it like that week. I just worked like feverishly for like a week, and I was like, I have her hair.
When you watch this short, you feel like you can touch this. There's the scale, the depth of field, the textures, they feel very handcrafted, which is exactly what you were going for. What kind of tips would you give to get that feel?
In terms of texturing, I try and look at everything and think of everything at like 4 times scale. Because if you think about like when you hold a toy, like if you have a toy truck and it has like a wooden bed, the wood texture on that toy will not be realistically proportioned to the truck, right? It would be like this tiny wood grain. No, they're going to make like that wood texture like 4 or 5 times bigger so that you can see it on the toy. So like scale is a huge part of it. Variety of textures and things like that, of course, there's a lot of fabrics, woods. I've seen like when a lot of people want to do stop motion, they just toss like a clay shader on everything. Like mix it up. I tried to make all the details larger than life, so for example, in the scene with the cat, when he's in the cardboard box, there's like little thumbtacks around, and they're big, chunky thumbtacks. Like they're not realistic proportions. Like the edge loops and the bevels are like 3-4 times what they should be. And that ends up giving everything a toy look, because if you think about what like a toy tree looks like versus a real tree, it's going to be big chunky details, big round features. So I focus a lot on the proportions and the colors. When it comes to the textures, then I actually try and use somewhat realistic texturing. And sure, it's 4 times the size it normally would be, but like let's use realistic textures and realistic edgeware. And what that ends up doing is kind of creating this like object that looks like a toy, but kind of looks like you can grab it because there's like the realism of the textures and how it's reacting to the lighting. It's a pretty known fact that one of the mistakes a lot of beginners make in 3D with textures is that they just put a texture on it and it's flat. There's going to be something off about it. It's going to look clean. It's going to look pristine. So most people know that when it comes to textures, like, oh, you want edgeware, you want grunge, you want some roughness variation. I feel like when lighting, that doesn't get talked about as much. Most people, they like either just pop an HDRI into the scene, which can get a lot done. Cycles in particular, I'm not a huge fan of how like HDR lighting works. Like when I've used Redshift, it's like, yeah, you can get a pretty like cool lighting setup with just an HDRI, but they end up just putting like area lights and spotlights in there, which are essentially perfect, clean lights that can't exist in real life, right? So with a lot of my lighting, I used like Gobo texture packs, and things like that. And I've mentioned that in my videos and have links to the one I used. One is just making the lighting feel a bit more realistic by treating it like a texture or treating it like you would in the compositing phase and adding a bit of irregularity to it so that it feels like real lighting rather than perfect digital lights. The other thing is that a lot of people, I've noticed, they just get focused on like really basic 3-point lighting. 3-point lighting is like what you see anytime you Google how to do lighting. And 3-point lighting is also the most like boring type of lighting you can do. So one thing I focused on was contrast. So, from film school, we learned about contrast, that there's 2-to-1 contrast ratios and 3-to-1, meaning that you're measuring things in stops, and this side of your face is this many stops lower or higher than this side of your face, and it creates contrast. And contrast is what creates interest. Contrast is what creates shape. It's not the lighting that makes your image look interesting. It's the shadows that come from your lighting that make the image look interesting. And then color too. There's a lot of people, they just toss white lights everywhere in their scene, whereas I try to treat my lights like I would a color scheme. So like I was actually downloading color schemes from like Adobe Color and mixing that into my lighting setups to try and create a bit more interesting cohesion there. Because if you have 2 lights on the opposite side of the color spectrum, they're going to cancel each other out. And sometimes combining things like blue and yellow light at the wrong spots is going to create this ugly green overlap.
Nice, man. It's great insight. What's it like being your own client?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So you don't send this off to somebody else and they review it and go, what about this? I'm the one QCing this. I'm the one making the creative decisions. What's it like working as an individual on a project like this?
Yeah, there's 2 sides of that. There's the how do you maintain creative motivation and inspiration, and then how do you manage the production and, keep things moving. From a production standpoint, I thought there were more, and now I'm realizing as I enter festivals, there's not. There's like a lot of these animation projects that I thought were done by single animators are actually done by like teams of friends. I didn't realize that what I was doing was kind of weird. So rather than looking to other productions for inspiration on how to maintain a production pipeline, I actually looked to video game studios. So that's where like things like the animation layers and using the walk cycles, because it's like that's what they do. It's like they don't have time to do unique animations for every scene, so they just they create walk cycles and they mix and match. So a lot of my animations are mix and matched, and admittedly my animation can be very crude or simple. That's a limitation I'm like willing to do. I know that I got away with a lot because of my style more so than like if an actual animator got in there, they could rip apart my animations pretty easily.
Like you said earlier, I'm going to not have fingers to animate because it's a pain, and me personally, I don't like having to animate, like doing lip sync and technical things. So if I can strip that out and still tell the story and still not let that hinder me and take up too much time, that's surely beneficial.
Yeah, and surprisingly, people think that I like, since it's kind of like a handcrafted style, they think I look to stop motion for inspiration, but I actually look to Nintendo for inspiration. They make these amazing looking games on this like hardware that like runs like a toaster, right? There's just like no, it's so weak. So I was looking at like Animal Crossing and like Zelda, and like what did they do? And it's like, oh well, like one thing they do is it's like the arms are detached from the body mesh. If you play like, like Gears of War, like it's like this whole character like built out with like perfect topology, whereas like Nintendo just cuts it off at the shoulder and then pushes it into the body. So I just did that, and then I just like on the character, I just put like wear on the paint, so it just looked like it was on a socket and that it was just wearing the paint off. And then so I wasn't doing as much mesh deformation, so it renders quicker, and it was easier to model and rig. So a lot of little tricks like that I pulled from games, and was really strict on myself from a production standpoint of keep it simple. I'm a really big proponent of planning. I would create characters, would create assets, I'd create drawings, try and get the creativity out of my system, but I refused to start animating scenes until I had a full shot list and a full scene list and everything was organized.
As tempting as it is, shall I just go and play with the walk cycle for a bit?
Exactly.
Especially being in a viewport where you can turn on all the fancy stuff and play with cameras, you can get lost in that.
Oh yeah, and so many artists, they have all this excitement, that excitement wears off, and then it just becomes work. And if you don't have a plan, then it's work without direction. It's also important to avoid perfectionism loops, I quit everything at about 95%. They always say that last 5% takes, half the project. And I was like, I don't have time for that. And I was like, the only people that can see that 5% are like other professionals. And it's like, they're a very small part of my audience. Now, getting onto the creative side of things, I think you have two challenges. One is overcoming that excitement and getting through the work. And then the other end is, maintaining ideas and quality. So, a challenge of working on your own is that you're not working with a bunch of other talented artists to make it better. One thing I did to keep myself motivated, getting that excitement out, and then as you said, it's tempting to get in there and play and start making stuff. That's the beauty of social media, is that like I can just post a loop of Watermelon Girl running, and it's like I kind of got it out of my system. Like I made something, and then I got feedback from the community, which helped me, right? And that community feedback helped me shape the film. So for example, the whale character was just a fun little character I made, and what I was really creating with that scene was the ocean for Watermelon Girl. But the whale was not a character, it was just a character I could make quickly to turn it into a full post. But the thing is that whale at the time took off and became my most engaged social media post.
Oh, really?
I did a couple other posts with the whale, and like every time it was like boom, 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 the whale blew up. So initially in the story, what happened is a sea monster came up. It was like a tentacle with an eye, and it like grabbed her and pulled her under the ocean. But the whale did so well that I ended up altering the story. So that it ended up her helping the whale get out from under the wreckage. So that's kind of a point that like you can put things out there on the internet and see like what clicks with people. And Watermelon Girl initially had a much different design too. She was a lot longer, elongated, had a little bit more like Tim Burton eyes. But one of my other characters took off, it's like a little goober character is what I call it. And it's like a little green guy with like kind of goo coming out of his head. He's always in the woods. If you looked at my artwork, I'm sure you've seen it.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, and that character was doing so well to the point that I almost considered switching from Watermelon Girl to a story about them. But instead, what I did is I went back and redesigned Watermelon Girl to match her proportions to him. And then suddenly the Watermelon Girl post started doing better. It's very interesting that like with the internet, you can toss things out there with people and like see like what works and feed off of it. So even though I didn't have like a team of artists, like an art director and a character designer to kind of like get together and like figure things out, that was like one way is community feedback.
That's a great way. It's like a daily session, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like you're putting it out there and like, they're giving feedback and you go, oh, that's great. And that's a really great way to engage the community. And at the same time, that you're luring them in and they're buying into these characters and then they want to come along for the journey,
It really did over time, based on people's feedback and response to things, kind of shape the look of the scenes and the characters and even the story to some degree. And, that's a benefit of kind of sharing it along the way and really seeing what resonates with people or not. Because I've noticed when a lot of people work on their own personal projects, they get so stuck in like, this is mine. I have to make it mine, and it's like, I tried to be very open-minded to like, well, people like this character more and people don't like this. And I wanted to make more clay, but they're really digging this style. So I think that was just important along the way. It was a big, long journey with a lot of factors. So
yeah.
The other benefit of that is that I kind of built a business around it. As I was learning things along the way, I was getting asked a lot of questions about my artwork. So I started putting it into tutorial formats, which turned into YouTube, which turned into a business. And I mean, like my asset pack, which is my highest selling product.
We bought that a few weeks ago.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, man. We used it on a few things. We love it.
Nice. Yeah. So I used, well, thank you, by the way. But those are materials that I created for the asset browser to drag and drop into my scenes. And that made money along the way, which then motivated me more. And then tutorials with sponsorships and then courses were like informing what I was doing. It's like, I have to learn rigging. So why don't I teach rigging? Because if I teach rigging, I'll learn it much quicker. And all that served as like goals and check marks and achievements. So even though I had this daunting 13-minute short film that would be so easy to fail out on, I could think of it as, well, it's a short film, but I've made 100 YouTube videos, 3-4 courses, 2 product packs, a few free products, and a Patreon along the way. So I've technically been like checking boxes and finishing things the entire time.
The side quests.
Exactly.
It's like a side quest on a video game, isn't it?
That's amazing. Yeah. Side quests all along the way so that like, you know, I was getting that dopamine rush of finishing something and didn't feel like it was this never ending uphill battle. I learned a lot along the way. Like I learned the whole Substance suite on this project. Designer, Sampler, Painter have become like probably my favorite piece of software right after Blender. You know, learned some things in Adobe, had to teach myself color grading. I think that's one of the weakest aspects of the film is the color grading. And ironically, the animation, even though that's my favorite part.
2D facial animations, is that a post After Effects thing, or is that done all in Blender?
So all the facial animations are done in a composition in After Effects, exported as a PNG sequence, and then plastered onto the character to render in 3D.
Are you animating with no faces, or can you see anything whilst you're working?
Yeah, I did some simple rigs in 3D where like I could like flick between like a couple preset faces. So it's like, oh, she's sad here, she's happy here. And then I would export a viewport render and put it in the background and then kind of animate the face as I went.
Gotcha.
In retrospect, I could have maybe spent a couple more weeks and developed a much more robust facial rig for Watermelon Girl. At the time of starting Watermelon Girl, I didn't quite have the rigging knowledge to create a rig that would have been easy to use and efficient in Blender. So I opted for After Effects. On my next project, I don't think I would do that pipeline. The back and forth was super cumbersome, required a ton of re-renders, a ton of issues. And then when you're trying to work out of something like Google Drive, you end up getting like overwrite errors and things as you're trying to go back and forth. And it was the right solution for me at the time. With the rigging knowledge I have now, I probably would do something a lot more complex with image sequences, UV maps, and other things, and probably have a much better time doing it. But yeah, at the time I used a combination of After Effects to that, and that was kind of the best solution for me. Realistically, I would have actually liked to have hired a cell animator and just had them do some really high-end facial animations, because her animation was so simple that the face is where all the expression came in. And I think for a single person with the tools I had, I did a good job. But like if you look at like the Lego movie, they did it really well.
Crank up those subwoofers, dude. And check this out.
But, you know, I'm happy with how it turned out.
Oh, yeah, we are too. I'm just going to touch on like project management. This is just a personal question for me. Like we use a thing called Prism for our project management in Blender. What was it like for you on this project?
For a while there, I was using like Asana. That was one that I'd been like exposed to like try and plan things. And project management software in the industry, there's a ton of options out there. And some really powerful options. But like things I started to run into is that like, oh, these are designed for teams, which means that there is literally a producer's job to just basically spend an hour or two every day updating this thing. So I needed something that worked for me. So my channel got sponsored by Milanote. It came in just at the right time where I was like, oh, this is perfect. Because the problem I was having is I had so many ideas, and Milanote just allowed me to just splatter things on there like a sticky note, but then to organize them into cards and organize them into timelines. And so Milanote was actually the software I ended up using for all of my project management. So that's how I organized the whole story. That's how I wrote the whole script. That's how I did all the narration. I put some artboards in there, a lot of my ideas in there, and that really organized like all of that aspect.
I mentioned Prism, and I may have used it in the wrong term, but we use it for like the pipeline. So, you know, you do a play blast and it automates naming conventions and it keeps everything organized in terms of like version control of stuff like that. Was there anything like that you used, or was it just a straight up like render it out into a folder and then you create your own folder structure?
Yeah, I created my own folder structure, which was very tedious. So like if I do another short film, I'm going to look into software like Prism.
We're not sponsored by them or anything, but something to look at, because it's definitely changed the way that we've worked in Blender and whatever software we're using, you know.
If I do another project, I would probably use Milanote to get all my ideas out and write everything, look into something to automate the actual folder structure and the preview exports, because I spent a lot of time managing folders and I think I wasted a lot of time there.
You're going to love Prism.
Yeah, and I think I needed something like that.
Big time. We found that with Prism, it's like, you know, before that we were like manually doing play blasts and then having to just go into the output part of Blender and just change it to like version 2 and then changing it for the next version and all this and putting it into the right folder the next time we want to put it somewhere else. And whereas this, it's like you got an interface, you got a button at the top, a quick drop down opens up, you go play blast or render, and you can manage render layers, as complex or as simple as you want to use it. It's super intuitive.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited to try that out.
A dream to use, you know.
Like software wars where people get really like hold down into like, no, this is the best software. And I'm like, no, that doesn't matter because there's people still making good stuff in 3ds Max. Like it's really about the artist. So I think it's very important to be software agnostic and try and learn as much as you can, because when I look at the industry and I see people much older or more experienced than I am, the ones that are succeeding are not the ones that are using the same thing they did 20 years ago. It's the ones that are always learning new tools. So I try and be very open-minded when it comes to tool sets and alternatives and other options. My next big learning path is Unreal Engine and trying to learn Unreal Engine 5. So
brilliant, man. Well, we can't wait to see what you create in Unreal Engine 5. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on with the process of the watermelon that I wouldn't do that again, or that was the biggest pain in my butt?
Yeah.
Anything that you've learned from it so that you just wouldn't go there again?
Having failed on this project multiple times and wanting to encourage other people to pursue their own personal projects, because I don't think I've ever met an artist that didn't have some passion project in mind, but most artists I've met have not actually made that passion project. If you truly want to accomplish your passion project, you really need to sit down and write out everything you're going to do. And it's going to be boring and it's going to be horrible and you don't want to do it and you're not going to enjoy it and you're going to hate every minute of it. And there's nothing you're going to do to make like it. But sit down and make a plan before you start, and an actual plan. Like I'm talking like full shot list, all the characters you're going to need, all the environments you're going to need, all the textures you're going to need. Like write down everything and make it a checklist, and then make that checklist have some sort of effect, whether it's a ding, whether it fills a progress bar or something, because as you watch that go up, you will feel like you are making progress along the way. That will really encourage you to go.
That's great advice. I was going to go on to like top advice for someone making a film like this, but that's answered it perfectly. Is there any big no-no for someone taking on a big project like this or starting out?
3 things. 1, design for your skill set. I knew that I was better at lighting and composition than I was animation. And then in terms of things to just flat out avoid, perfectionism is like the greatest enemy of passion projects. I talked about this a bit before. Just stop at 95%. 95% is okay. And then lastly, sometimes when we're trying to procrastinate as artists, we can get stuck in what I call a tutorial loop, which is where you will just go down a learning path and just keep learning things. Like, oh, I'm going to do simulations, so I'm just going to keep learning simulations. And then you never actually make a simulation. You're just too busy watching how to make simulations. You walk away thinking like you learned all this stuff, but because you haven't used it, you don't really know how to do any of it. So be careful of tutorial loops, because it's really just a form of productive procrastination. It's important to be a lifelong learner, but if you're not taking those things and applying it, you're really just kind of putting off like what you need to do. So avoid tutorial loops, avoid perfectionism, and play to your strengths would be kind of my 3 big things.
3 great pieces of advice. Well, Shotty, that was such a blast to just dive into your process. Honestly, I thoroughly enjoyed that. And we've got one of these.
Yeah.
No, that's a weak clap, actually. Hold on.
Get a big roar. Oh, there we go. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, no, thanks, Shotty. It's a pleasure, honestly. Thanks for your time, man.
It's always exciting when people take an interest in it or want to hear more talk about the process. And it's really exciting to hear how many people enjoyed it too.
We thoroughly enjoyed it, and a lot of blood, sweat and tears have gone into that project.
Oh, yeah. I really appreciate that.
Is there any final things like news of Shotty? Is there any new add-ons that you've been working on? Any packs that you've got coming out? Anything super quick to tell people?
Yeah, I'm working on updating my 2 packs. I haven't done an update in a while because of production. So for people who've already bought those, there's some stuff in the works there.
Brilliant.
And then I am working on 2 new courses. One's going to be kind of like a simple course on walk cycles and just kind of like for beginners, just doing their very first walk cycle. But then I'm working on a slightly bigger course that will take a lot of my learnings from Watermelon Girl and putting them into like one longer course to really kind of cover some of the production tips and tricks I learned along the way. And then in Watermelon Girl itself, I'm now taking it and shopping it around as pitching it for a series. So we'll see how that goes too.
That's great. Well, we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
I just want to say thanks for your time. That was brilliant.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a good evening.
Take care, man.